Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are. Welcome everybody to this SACRU webinar entitled The Place of Doubt in the Credibility of Science. My name is Laia Ros Blanco. I'm chemist. After finishing my doctorate in chemistry or in pharmaceutical chemistry, I became the head of the Research and Innovation Office at Ramon-Llull University. And together with David Kirchhofer, today I'll be moderating the discussion, or our conversation. David is currently the director of the Queensland Bioethics Centre at the Australian Catholic University. And in addition to this doctorate in theological ethics, he also holds a Bachelor of Science degree with majors in advanced biology and psychology. Hi, David. Let me also introduce, give a warm welcome, to our three panelists, starting by Fabian Jaksic, who is currently professor and director of the Center of Applied Ecology and Sustainability of the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. Fabian is an expert in community ecology, biological invasions, functional biodiversity, ecosystem functioning. Welcome, Fabian, and thank you for being here. We also have Philip Landrigan, pediatrician and epidemiologist. He's the director of the Program for Global Public Health at the Common Good at Boston College. He's an expert in public environmental and occupational health, studying the health impacts of toxic environmental hazards. Thank you also, Philip, for joining us today. And we have Angela Wagner, Professor Emerita at Pontificia Universidad Católica de Rio de Janeiro since 2014. She focused her research on environmental and marine chemistry, working as visitor professor at multiple institutions around the world. Thank you all. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laia, and welcome everybody. It's wonderful to have you join us here for what I think is going to be a really exciting discussion about a topic that is really quite fascinating and something we don't always think about a great deal, but it's really become very important. You know, science has come to dominate so much of our public discourse in recent years. We've seen it obviously in the debate about climate change, and obviously very recently in debates about the various public health efforts in relation to the COVID pandemic and in relation to vaccines. And it seems that in the public discourse, science takes on a certain kind of mystique that ends up being either science presented as an absolute fact that is incontrovertible in all ways, or the other end of the spectrum, something that should be doubted and treated with great skepticism as a great conspiracy by political machinations. And this polarity that we see in the way that science is presented is unhelpful, I think, in a number of ways. Most importantly, because it is not a good reflection, I think, of how science really works. And it was Avery Dulles, a theologian, who talked about the role of doubt in faith and the relationship between doubt and faith. And he argued for the idea of a virtue of doubt, that doubt could actually be a Christian virtue. And I think any good scientist would recognize how doubt plays a role in science, because it raises the very questions in the first place. If we don't doubt something, what questions are there to be even asked? And so this webinar is aimed at discussing that very idea. What is the role of doubt in the credibility of science? What role does doubt actually play in helping us to believe, if you like, to use a faith analogy, in science? So it is in that respect that I'm very pleased to have this great panel with us to talk about this topic. But I'm also really pleased to have you with us to talk about this topic, because this is going to be a Q&A forum. And that means you can ask questions too. You will see in your screen that you have a Q&A box, and you can type your questions into that Q&A box. And when you do that, it'll appear in the Q&A box. We won't necessarily immediately answer your question in the Q&A box. So that's the tricky part. What will happen is we have a team of people behind the scenes that you can't see who'll be moderating those questions, and they will be monitoring whether or not those questions are being answered in what's being said. And if not, then they will then present to us in another way the question, and we'll ask that question for you to the panel. So if you have questions, we really welcome them, and that makes the discussion that much more interesting when we're able to bring in those questions from the floor. So I look forward to receiving your questions and being able to ask them to our wonderful panel. But now I'm going to hand you back to Laia, who's going to set us off with the first question to the panel.
Actually, you already introduced the topic so well. I think doubt has been considered essential to science since long before even the scientific method was established in the 17th century. Actually, many opinion articles have been published, as David already said, stating maybe even that skepticism plays a crucial role in producing robust research. Do you agree with it, or do you think is the place of this doubt in science? Fabian, maybe the floor is yours if you want to start.
Thank you. Let me start by saying that I'm an environmental scientist, so everything is tinted with this view from the environment. I will start by saying that by definition, science provides provisional explanations to a phenomenon, explanations that may be negated or modified in the near future according to new information collected, or because of a new theory that explains more facts with fewer assumptions. This is the principle of parsimony, as everybody knows. Science, therefore, is not in the business of revealing or disclosing the truth, but in providing plausible explanations in the form of hypotheses or theories. What science calls facts are indeed observations or data about facts. It follows then that a given fact may provide a variety of data depending on the observer. One major way science advances is through experimentation. In some cases, a crucial experiment may be devised with the expected result being either a resounding yes or a no to a given scientific question. But most experiments do not yield crucial results, but probabilistic results. Scientists do not test whether some observations are true, but whether they are not false. True or false, in this case, refers to the alignment of results with the explanatory hypothesis being tested. In short, the scientist can say, the probability that my explanation is false is 1 in 20 cases. That is 5% of the cases. If the probabilistic expectation is even better, for instance, 1 in 100 cases, then the scientist may have a higher confidence. But you never reach total confidence in the explanation. So there is never certainty. A scientist may say, I am confident that blah, blah, blah. Never, I am certain that blah, blah, blah. Therefore, a scientist is always in doubt. When there is no possibility of making experiments, the burden of doubt increases. But this component of doubt can be quantified, and decisions may be made on that basis. One can ask, not what is the certainty that something will happen, but what is the likelihood that something would happen. This is exactly the case of global climate change. Scientists cannot ensure what will happen, but they can predict with a quantified confidence level what may happen. What may happen if current conditions or disturbances, such as emissions of greenhouse gases, are going to affect us in the foreseeable future. People negating climate change take a cheap shot at scientists when saying that there is no certainty of what will happen, that there is doubt. Again, I emphasize, science is not in the business of providing certainty, but of reducing uncertainty, which is quite different. And this takes us to the field of risk. Without certainty, one must risk doing or not doing something. Risk is a perceived consequence of a given fact, a prediction of what may happen if one takes or does not take a given course of actions, or reverses it to a certain point. With regard to climate change, in this case, what the scientists are saying is that if we do not cease to burn fossil fuels or raise cattle, the risk of changing the global climate is high and not favorable for the well-being of us humans. Summarizing, science is a healthy exercise of pondering doubt, quantifying likelihood of predictions, and assessing risk. It depends on us if we are willing to follow science rather than credence or belief or faith. Nonetheless, one may have faith in science, but should keep in mind that science is about pondering doubt, not providing certainty. And this is my position. Thank you.
Interesting. Angela, what's your point on this?
Well, since World War II, we have had an extraordinary social and economic development. The generation born just after the war was possibly the first of human history to endure a lifespan of more than 70 years, with continuous increase in the quality of living and life expectation. In special, the scientific advances and discoveries, for instance, in the health-related science, food production and security issues, allow an extension of life expectation, lifted billions of people from poverty and improved the quality of life. In chemistry, there were many breakthroughs. Just to cite a few, the discovery of pesticides that allowed producing food in large scale as necessary to feed billions, the discovery of antibiotics and products to treat a vast array of diseases and to abate pain. Today, people take for granted the comforts offered by modern science and technologies. However, up to about 100 years ago, living and in many cases dying imposed hardship at levels one now can hardly conceive. Global development has been possible due to dissemination and application of science and technology, and in many cases on improved political and economic institutions. Never before economies were so integrated, mobility was so easy and intense. Instant communication is now possible, despite where one is located in the globe. This turned out to have positive and negative outcomes. Some of the negative sides are the environmental impacts derived from high mobility and the fast dissemination of malicious and unapprised information, creation of networks of falsehood, with the potential of producing tragic outcomes. A side effect of fast communication I would like to stress is the growing consumption of ready-to-use culture. Obtaining information from books in paperback or electronic format grew rarer. Results from this are obvious. For instance, the question of undisputed knowledge, such as the Earth is round and orbits around the sun, vaccines are effective against virus infections, and etc. We have witnessed a sharp disruption in aspects of communication, not bound to technology per se. For instance, people became addicted to short information with a minimum of content, as opposed to lengthy and accurate text. Even university students find it hard to elaborate a subject into a comprehensive text. We are witnessing the benefits, they do exist, and the harms of communication technologies. We might hope that human science and technology do find a common pathway to correct this trend that, in my view, causes so much harm to the youngsters and impair their growth as entirely capable human beings. The growing trend to consider science as unnecessary and unreliable derives from ignorance, but can be understood based on the fact that public in general finds difficulty in dealing with scientific uncertainty. Except for mathematics, in which absolute proof is the goal, and once matter is proved, it is forever, all other sciences deal with hypotheses and that must be tested against experimental evidences. Science is in continuous advance, building new knowledge upon previous existing facts. The development we witnessed during the actual pandemic are good examples of knowledge building process, although progress occurred somewhat chaotic. As a result, much information was conveyed to the public before scientific confirmation or consensus. For instance, as related to the use of masks, to the need to disinfect surface, to the modes of virus transmission, among other issues, causing confusion among non-professionals and feeding the misinformation through social media. In the case of Brazil, unaware and uncultured leadership led to a tragic outcome for the people during these times. Brazil has had an organized vaccination program to prevent numerous diseases. These programs count with high adherence of the population, and it was rare to hear opinions contrary to the benefits of vaccine. Since information released that vaccines were available to prevent SARS-CoV-2, however, government leading a significant fraction of the population rejected the vaccine effectiveness. Fortunately today, because of growing pressure of many sectors and the press influence, situation has changed and 90% of the population do intend to be vaccinated. Also, because of government disbelief in vaccine, therefore refused to purchase those developed in 2020. The country with an actual death toll between 2,000 and 3,000 persons a day faces difficulties to obtain the products in the international market. I would like now to draw some thoughts on the environmental issues as related to Brazil. Unfortunately, these issues became likewise a matter of dispute at the political level and in the social media. Those against all previous laws and measures to protect the forest, for instance, our biggest treasure, believe developed countries have hidden interests and pursue the exploration of resources in their own benefit. Populism is a second reason politicians deny evidences from solid scientific information related to climate change and the benefits Brazil earns from the mere existence of a standing forest. Brazilian territory includes more than 8,000 kilometers of coast and extension with a large fraction from north to south covered by mangrove forest. A number of bays and embayment vital to preservation of marine life are also there. Due to accelerated population growth over the last 50 years and the migration of people to urban centers in pursuit of a better life, presently more than 70% of the Brazilian population, amounting of 220 million more or less, live in coastal states and coastal cities. As a result from increasing population density and very low investments on basic sanitation services, bays associated to large urban centers, such as the Guanabara, the Santos, and the Todos dos Santos bays, are severely contaminated by sewage and chemicals. Maybe in the next future, with the availability of technologies, some recovery will be possible, but at a very high cost. In the environmental world, there are different views on how shall we solve the impacts caused by accelerated economic and population growth of the last 100 years. Some emphasize limits to growth, while others are convinced that human inventiveness, scientific and technological advances will succeed in solving side effects from our continuous path to growth. Certainly, different environmental issues might find solutions based on science technologies, while others will depend upon wise political decisions. In my view, never before educated and enlightened political leadership was so vital to the well-being and the existence of human race on Earth. Finally, strengthening educational systems available to all might shed light upon the dark paths opening ahead. Thank you.
You raised very important points too, Angela. Thank you so much. Philip, would you add also your point of view?
Thank you, Laia. Thank you, colleagues, for your enlightening remarks. So I'm a medical doctor, and so I'm going to begin by talking about the place of doubt in medical practice, because I started out as a medical practitioner, but then I evolved into a scientist, a public health scientist, and so I'll talk about how doubt then has a place in unraveling questions that confront us in public health. So let's start out talking about the place of doubt in the practice of clinical medicine, which of course is a very applied, a very immediate form of science. And I think of doubt as being open-minded, as being humble, as being respectful of the truth. And a concrete example, I'm a young doctor. I'm called to an emergency room because an 8-year-old child has come into the emergency room with abdominal pain and vomiting. And so I go in with I always ask myself in that circumstance, what's the worst thing that could happen here? What's the disease that could kill this child? 99% of diseases in children, of course, don't kill them. The children get better, but some do kill them. And so it's always important to have in the back of your mind the possibility that this could be something very dangerous that requires very rapid intervention if we're to save the child's life. So in the case of a child with a belly pain, the worst thing that can happen most of the time is that it would be a case of acute appendicitis. And so the decision that confronts the doctor in that circumstance is to decide whether or not it's a case of appendicitis. And there are risks in both directions. If it turns out just to be a mild case of gastroenteritis, a self-limiting disease from which the child will recover, but I go ahead and operate on the child, it means an unnecessary operation with all the risks of anesthesia and surgery and the rest of it. But on the other hand, if it really is a case of appendicitis and I fail to operate, if I decide I'm not going to do anything, and then a few hours later the appendix bursts and fills the child's abdomen with infectious material, we get a terrible condition develop, which is called peritonitis, which can take the child's life, and even if the child recovers, can leave the child with significant health problems. And so the way a doctor approaches that circumstance is you formulate the hypothesis that this might be a case of appendicitis and you need to rule it out. And the way you either rule it in or rule it out is by first taking a history, learning the child's symptoms, then doing a physical examination, then doing some blood tests, maybe doing some x-rays or ultrasounds of the abdomen. And then you come to a conclusion and you make your decision. And you know, as Fabian said, that the decision is not going to be perfect in either direction. You're basically balancing likelihoods. Is this likely to be a case of appendicitis or likely not? And you make a decision. But you also don't stop there because, of course, the child is still in front of you. And even if you decide not to operate, you don't walk away, go home and go to sleep and wake up the next morning. You stay around, or you have one of your associates stay around, and you watch the child very closely. You keep an open mind. You retain a figment of doubt. And if the child's condition changes, you quickly change your decision and then you intervene. So it's a concrete example, but I hope it maybe illustrates some of the realities. Now, turning to COVID, I don't think it's ever been more clearly illustrated in my lifetime as a physician or a scientist how important it is to pay attention to the data and to pay attention to the data as the data evolve, as new information comes in, because this has been anything but a static situation. First, we had to learn about the nature of the virus, the nature of the infection, the way it played out in different people of different age groups. Well, we learned slowly but surely about the fact that some cases of the disease result in long-term complications that may be with people for years to come. But we learned those facts only by being open to information, by keeping open doubt and skepticism, and being honest with ourselves and receiving new information as it comes in. The people that went into the COVID pandemic with a fixed point of view, saying, for example, that this is not a problem, we can dismiss it, it's some kind of a political hoax. People that didn't pay attention to the information as it came in, the facts as they came in, those are the people that have cost thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives around the world. Whereas the people that went into the situation with openness and humility and the willingness to change their strategy as the facts develop, those are the people who have effectively saved lives. And we're seeing that play out now as the vaccines come along. So I'm asked very frequently, how good are the vaccines? And there's no absolute answer as to how good the vaccine is. It's not a theological truth. Instead, the way you determine whether the vaccine is effective is you do what are called intervention trials. And what the vaccine manufacturers did was they found several thousand people who were willing to participate in a trial. Half of the people receive the vaccine and half of them receive an injection of saline, salt water. And then those people are tracked over 3 or 4 months in time. And what they found, for example, in the Pfizer vaccine, that out of a couple of thousand people that received the salt water, 37 of them developed COVID. And out of the people that developed vaccine, 2 developed COVID. So doing the math, that shows that the vaccine is approximately 95 or 96% effective. It's not a perfect vaccine. No vaccine is perfect, but at least it is those sorts of intervention trials establish the efficacy of the vaccine. Then the next question is, okay, how long does the immunity last? Is it going to be like yellow fever vaccine, which gives a lifetime of immunity? Is it going to be like tetanus vaccine, which gives 7 to 10 years of immunity? Is it going to be like influenza vaccine, which if you're lucky protects you for 12 months? And I've been asked this question 100 times, and the answer is I don't know. The only way I'll know is with the passage of time, by observing whether or not people who have received the vaccine remain protected against COVID in 2021, in 2022, or 2023, or do they start falling sick in the second or the third year? Then we'll know from experience how frequently we have to revaccinate people in order to maintain protection. And we don't know the answer to that yet. Doubt is alive and well. So doubt is a very powerful tool in science, but like any tool, it can be misused. And if I can share my screen for just a moment, I'm going to show a single slide speaking to this topic. So unfortunately, there have been some corruptors of science out there who have used doubt as a malignant tool to interfere with the pursuit of knowledge. People that have been referred to in this particular book that I'm showing here as merchants of doubt. The merchants of doubt is a concept that had its origins in the 1950s and 1960s, probably has historical roots that go deeper, but in modern times started in the 1950s and 1960s when the tobacco industry was getting very worried about the scientific studies showing a high rate of lung cancer and heart disease and other diseases in people who smoke cigarettes. And so the tobacco industry found some scientists who were willing to do what I call bogus studies, where they would manipulate the data, manipulate the findings, manipulate the interpretation of the data, and say something like at the end, well, there's a slight risk of lung cancer, but it may be due to any one of a number of other possible confounding factors, such as the fact that these people were predestined to get cancer, or they lived badly, or they were immoral, or they ate too much, or something else. You can make up the rest of the story. And we've seen that strategy play out for tobacco, for asbestos, for various chemicals, and most recently, of course, most blatantly, most dangerously, in the case of climate change, where scientists who are allied with the fossil fuel industry have manufactured doubt about the reality of climate change, have impugned the scientific findings, have even in some cases gone after the scientists who generate the data. And for example, one scientist in this country, the fossil fuel industry, put private detectives on him to try to find flaws in his private life, which they figured would somehow undermine the credibility of his science. So how does the scientific community deal with this malignancy? It's hard to cut it out because these things tend to grow back. But we have developed strategies for finding truth in real world circumstances in the face of great uncertainty. The most powerful means of cutting through manufactured doubt is to do an intervention that changes the course of reality and very clearly establishes cause and effect. For example, we now know that if a person stops smoking, their risk of lung cancer goes way down within a few years, and their risk of heart disease goes down almost overnight because they're no longer taking carbon monoxide into their body. In the case of climate change, of course, it's not possible to do an intervention experiment. There is, as the green groups say, there is no planet B. So we have to fall back on the second strategy that scientists have evolved for resolving uncertainty, and that's to do repeated experiments, repeated collections of data by different people in different parts of the world using different technologies. And this is what's been done to strengthen the argument that climate change is real. So one set of experiments that has been done to validate the reality of climate change are the repeated measurements in different parts of the world using different technologies, showing the steadily increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since 200 or so years ago, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when we started burning large quantities of fossil fuel. Another have been multiple observations of the temperature of the Earth. There in the United States, we have NASA, which is the National Aeronautic and Space Administration, NOAA, which is the weather agency. There's the British records, there's the Japanese records, I think there's an Australian record. There are now 4 or 5 enormous data sets from around the world that differ a bit in detail, of course, but all show a steadily rising trend in global temperature since approximately the 1870s, the 1880s, with only minor differences between the different groups. So does any of this prove absolutely the reality of climate change? No, as Fabian said, science doesn't provide absolute truth. But what science provides is actionable information. And if at the end of the day, we see our mission on Earth as to be, one of our missions is to be good stewards of the planet that we have been given, that God has given us, then science is the best tool we have for directing our stewardship, for basing it in reality. And if we learn as we go along that something we thought was true is in fact not true, if the data show us the contrary, then we change direction. It's okay. The decision to operate on a child is not irrevocable, nor is the decision to act or not act on the climate. But we guide ourselves by the best science that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. And thank you to Angela and Fabian for those really valuable inputs. The good news is we have some questions from our our participants. And the first one comes from James Keenan at Boston College. And I'll put this to all of you. In light of the influence of populism, and we've all experienced that in different ways, what gives you hope and what raises concern for you about your own local culture's appreciation of the role of doubt as integral to the scientific investigation? So what gives you hope and what raises concerns about your local population's understanding of the role of doubt as integral to scientific investigation?
If I may say something,
yeah.
From my perspective, I live in a Latin American country, and we've been suffering the attacks of populism ever since about 20 years. But regardless of that, science still remains credible. So I'm not pessimistic about this. And as Philip said, the merchants of doubt surely are active in our region, but we still command, I mean, as scientists, we still command the faith of our nationals. So, of course, I have no data, okay? I could collect the data given the question, and that is how a scientist proceeds. I'm just talking out of my understanding of the local situation. So even though there's people like the merchants of doubt, even though there's people like Launberg from the Netherlands, I believe, that writes a whole book questioning the climate science, well, there are ways to prove that this is going to happen. And the one thing that I would like to raise is that we are not talking about your existence. Your existence is guaranteed in the short term, let's say for the next 2 or 3 decades. What we're talking is about the fate of your children and grandchildren. So you may choose to believe in science, or you may purchase the merchandise that the merchants of doubt are selling. It's up to you. You're going to survive this, but your children may not. That's it.
Thank you, Fabian.
I can add one to that. So, like Fabian, I remain optimistic. I honestly think that we may be smart enough, intelligent enough to get ourselves out of some of the messes that we're in. And I draw hope from some examples of triumphs in the recent past. So in the mid-1970s in the USA, as in many other countries, we were putting lead into gasoline, into petrol, to increase engine performance. And at peak use in the early 1970s, we were putting approximately 100,000 tons of lead into the gasoline supply in the USA. And that lead did not turn into gold except for the people who produced it. Instead, it went through the engine, out the exhaust, and contaminated the atmosphere. And our cities were contaminated with lead. There were corridors of lead along the highways, and the lead got into the air, it got into the dust, and from there it got into the people, especially into the children who live close to the ground. And the average blood lead level in American kids in those days was around 20 micrograms. Well, around that time, studies that we were involved in showed that those levels of lead in the body of a child could cause brain damage, that it would cause loss of cognitive function, reduction in IQ, shortening of attention span, various behavioral anomalies. And the pressure of that knowledge mounted. The lead industry and the fossil fuel industry did their best to deny it, to obscure it, to manufacture doubt about it. But the weight of the information accumulated for multiple repeated experiments done by multiple scientists in many countries. And finally, beginning in 1975, Our Environmental Protection Agency made the courageous decision in the face of great political pressure to remove the lead from gasoline. And what we saw was just astounding. Over the next 5 years, the blood lead levels decreased by 50%, and over the next 5 or 8 years by another 50%. So a total reduction in blood lead of about 95%, an increase in the intelligence of the whole population, a decrease in the rate of violent crime that started about 20 years later when those children came of age. Remarkable triumphs. We've seen reductions of more than 70% in levels of air pollution and in the diseases, the heart disease, the lung disease, the stroke that are caused by air pollution. And one of my missions as a public health scientist is to repeatedly tell the story of these triumphs, not to claim that science is some totemic, some iconic thing that we have to worship, but rather to remind people that it's a powerful tool for navigating reality, and as Fabian said, protecting the world for our children and our grandchildren. I think storytelling is very, very important in science.
Thank you.
Can I add
Angela,
some
yeah,
thoughts?
Angela, please tell us about your perceptions from Brazil.
Well, I think I was one of the first persons in the Southern Hemisphere to present a paper on climate change. Well, it was my PhD thesis, which I was presented in 1974. And we used the 3 rings to try to understand the variations of CO2 in the atmosphere through isotopic ratios, okay, in general. And so we do not, from this time on, a lot of data came up. And we are not talking now about science uncertainty on this matter. We are talking about believing, which is a complicated issue. And we are talking also about quitting a lot of our bad habits in terms of climate change. Who is willing not to eat meat anymore? Who is, or at least to decrease sharply the intake of cattle meat? Who is willing not to drive a car and have a public transportation? Or sometimes, which government is willing to invest in decreasing the need for private transportation and benefit public transportation, mainly in our countries, as Fabian was raising the issue. So it's also a question of a human attitude. Once we gain some facilities, we don't want to get rid of them. So I think this is basically a very important issue that can be dealt with by joining together human sciences and physical sciences. They don't work together much. But I think in this issue, it's very necessary that human science start to ally to physical science, work in the mind of people, trying to convince by their philosophical and psychological ways how people can change their mind, because otherwise we won't progress. We blame the industry that produces fossil fuels, but there must be a consumption from the other side. If they don't have a consumption, or if the consumption is decreased, they have to change their minds. So, for example, in Brazil, the situation is absurd. I live facing a forest here in Rio, a very privileged person here, and living in the pandemic, isolated at home, I could value this view. I could value the sounds. So there are so many important things that give quality of life and that we have to preserve and that we have to care for. And so this is a point we have to see. We cannot only blame the industry. Okay, they have their interests. They want to get money. There are rich people that want to give up anything, but there are the other side. We all together don't want to give up anything. So I think it's an issue to be discussed at any time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. Actually, we have also attendees from Tokyo. Liu Huan from Sophia University in Tokyo states, science has developed so many years, and there are many branches in with knowledge and information from different fields. She says the origin of science was to build a bridge to connect the human with the nature and to let us get a better understanding of the real world. However, in recent years, majority of researchers were producing so-called information pollution. And now our life is limited, but the knowledge and the information are infinite. She states it is very dangerous to pursue the infinite knowledge and all information with our limited life. The question is there any solution for this dilemma? So can we pursue the infinite knowledge with our limited life?
If I may start?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. But, you know, the more we live, the more we know. The more history passes, the more we know. So I don't really, what we need to do is just to borrow time from the future. And the future that we're pursuing now is a future towards extinction of the human race. So I think it is our duty to prolong that existence by, for instance, stopping destroying our planet or the resources on which our life is based upon. Okay, so I don't really expect a total pollution of information and of science unless we have plenty of time before us. The problem is that we do not have plenty of time, and we have to act today in order to ensure that we have more history in the future. That's it.
I'll add to that. I'll say that it's essential, it's imperative that we continue to do research, to make inquiries, to use these marvelous brains that God has given us to learn more and more and more about the world we live in. I don't consider it information pollution at all. I consider it the planting of a fertile garden. And then at the same time as we plant the garden, we've developed strategies for managing it. We have information technologies. We've developed techniques for doing what are called systematic reviews of the literature, so that in a very organized way we can extract the nuggets of most important information from all the papers that are published. But I welcome the proliferation of science. I think it's a good thing. I hope it continues.
Well, I think there is a philosophical aspect which always comes to my mind because of duality, so-called nature and human beings, as human beings were not part of nature. Anytime in history, and I have to stress that there was a religious background for this, humans stood out of nature, became above. Here's human, here down is nature. So we can exploit everything, all the resources, all the living and the non-living resources on our benefit. So we don't feel we are part of nature. And this is a question also of changing educational systems. Well, how can we prepare the next generation to have a different behavior from what our generation had? we consumed since the last Second World War resources and never before on the earth. And we will not stop unless we get some feeling that we are part of nature. The planet is not endangered. Plants will grow after we are not existing anymore on the surface of our earth. So we are endangered. Planet is not endangered. It will continue until the sun blows up. So I think we have to do more work on the public opinion and more educational activities to make our children, our youngsters, our students to understand that we are not above nature, we are part of nature, and danger is not the planet, but ourselves.
Thank you, Angela.
One of the ways some of the religious fundamentalists whom I know approach this very question that Angela has raised is in their interpretation of Genesis. I think it's chapter 6, where the way I was brought up to read that was that God gave mankind dominion over the earth, which many of my fundamentalist friends take as a license to rape and pillage the planet. And I think another way you can read that, and scholars are moving towards this, I think, guided by Pope Francis, is that they don't read that word as dominion. They read it instead as stewardship, which brings us back to what Angela says, that we are one with the planet. Our genes, many of the genes in our bodies, we share not only with our close cousins like the primates and the whales, but also with the insects. The reason, for example, that pesticides are so toxic to the human brain is that we have the same biological receptors in our brain as the mosquito. And so the organophosphate pesticide that kills mosquitoes can also kill us and make us sick. We're part of a great web of life that exists on this planet. We're not apart from it.
Thank you, Phil. We've got time, I think, for one more question, and this comes from Sergio Ferreira. Do Catholic research universities have a special mission to employ science in a way that is ethically serves both humankind and God? And what can SACRU do to that end?
If I may start,
Yeah.
I don't see any conflict. Religion is essentially concerned on how do we behave today with regard to another life. Okay, science has to do with day-to-day life. Okay, and therefore, if religion has aims, science provides the means, and that is what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabio.
I agree.
Right. One more question then. We seem to have some more space, and we'll go then to a question from Luca Valera at the Pontifical University of Chile. And he says, Fabian Jaksic talked about the importance of predictions in science. And the German philosopher Hans Jonas, in his Imperative of Responsibility, recalled this issue of predictions in science and introduced the heuristics of fear, that is, the prevalence of bad predictions over good ones in scientific investigations, and most of all in politics. Regarding environmental politics, which have an important social role in current days, and you could say probably the same about the politics of vaccination, it seems that apocalyptic and catastrophic visions proliferate. What do you think about this issue? Are these bad predictions really credible? Or do they mainly have persuasive or political roles in our societies?
If I may start.
It'll have to be a very short answer.
Yeah.
Because we've only got 3 minutes.
Yeah, this is the business of fake news. And unfortunately, in order to be able to sift and decide what to do based on false information. It's just to remember that based on lies, you cannot reach the truth. And unfortunately, that has to do with logics, and logics is not taught in many countries. And so people have faulty logic. If there were a real logic, I think the people would understand that you cannot derive a falsehood from the truth and vice versa. And that is a major problem, sure.
Thank you. Well, I think that brings us almost to the end of our session, and I would like to thank you all for joining us. It's been a great pleasure to have you all here. I think we've gained a great deal from your insights from diverse fields, which I think has made this panel particularly interesting, and Phil for your insights from medicine and public health, Fabian from environmental sciences, and Angela from the world of marine ecology and marine chemistry. It brings a whole new light to the question of science in a broad range, and particularly the role of doubt in the credibility of science. So I thank you all, and I thank also our participants all over the world who have joined us here this evening and provided such inspiring questions. And to my co-host Laia, thank you as well.
Just thank you to all. Just taking a few words of what our panelists have said, remain optimistic about science, although doubt is part of it. See you in the next, I hope, SACRU webinar. Thank you all for attending. Thank you all the panelists for participating too. And thank you, David, for co-moderating.
And have a good day or a good evening wherever you are.
Thank you very much. Have a good one.
Awesome.
yourself. Yep.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.